Master's of Divinity student at San Francisco Theological Seminary here in Marin. I am also working with the Marin Interfaith Council, which is the interfaith council for the county here. Our motto is to celebrate faith, to advocate justice, and to build community. And an interesting aspect of interfaith work in general is the growth of agnostic and atheist participants in the growing interfaith movement and in that conversation. So with that is this book that we are gathered to discuss and hear more about. It's called Faith, Essays from Believers, Agnostics, and Atheists. It's a collection of personal essays by 24 award-winning and best-selling authors, some of whom are here tonight, and we're looking forward to hearing from them. They're addressing the question, what do I believe? And within that is also, what do I not believe? Victoria Zackheim, who is the editor of this book, is a novelist, an editor, a playwright, a screenwriter. She teaches at UCLA. I'm pretty sure she's been involved with every genre of writing that's ever existed, and we welcome her tonight. Victoria Zackheim.
I don't write poetry.
There is something.
I tried. It was beyond humiliating. Especially when you think everything should rhyme. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Book Passage. I think I wanted to launch the book here. Today is the national launch for this book, and it didn't take 10 seconds for me to contact Book Passage and say, would you do it? Because this bookstore is so unbelievably and unequivocally supportive of writers for everything. I did a reading of a play here. They opened a room for me. The generosity here toward the creative community and toward the community, the reading community at large, is unparalleled. So Melissa, thank you. I would love to know more about what you're doing and participate in it one day. It's wonderful. Tonight, we're doing things a little bit differently because the book has been set up differently than before. My other anthologies, you have my introduction, and then you have the essays, and I have an essay in the book, and that's it. And there's a little closing at the end thanking people, and that's how we do it. But Beyond Words, which is part of Atria, Simon & Schuster, wanted to do it differently with this book, and they actually divided the book into sections, and they took what had been my essay and they broke it into fragments and used it as introductions to the different segments of the book. So it's been a fascinating experience for me because I look at the book differently now. And I said, well, you're not going to do like all the believers in one, all the atheists. They said, no, it's a very different kind of a feeling we want to give it. So I hope you buy the book. I hope you love the book. If you have suggestions or you want some of us to come and speak for your groups, we'd love to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of my introduction to the book, and then I'm going to call three of the writers up to read. And if we have time, Ann Perry is one of our writers, and because of visa problems, she's still locked out of the United States. And I think she'll be coming home very soon. She finally got to the top of the list at the ARO in Washington, which is a 130-day wait. It's taken her about 150. But anyway, she is very sorry she's not here tonight. She was looking forward to being here. This was her first essay that she'd ever written, and the first group dynamic she'd ever been a part of. So she's very disappointed. And if I have time, I'll read a little bit from her essay. So here we go. The day after Christmas, 1985, I received a phone call that would change my life in a way I never could have predicted. It was mid-morning and I was home alone enjoying a day free of client demands and killer deadlines. Political clients were on holiday from Congress, and my Silicon Valley clients, who were experiencing out-of-control growth and the kind of unlimited budgets that made freelance marketing writers very happy, were off to Aspen or Paris. I picked up the phone with trepidation, fearful that someone from Hewlett-Packard needed brochure copy before noon, or the marketing manager at Apple had been struck by another brilliant idea, and could I write the narration for a new video before midnight? Instead, I heard the voice of my friend Lee. Our daughters were also friends, cultish teenagers, in fact, as beautiful and smart as they were mischievous. Party girls, fashionistas, and heaven only knew what they would do when old enough to drive. My Lisa was 14, her Lizzie was 15, and we commiserated and plotted about how to keep them safe, but this call was not about sneaking out to a party or concerns about too much eyeliner. Lizzie's sick, she told me. We're not sure what, but we're in emergency, could you come? Of all my friends, Lee was the least melodramatic. When I heard that plea, I ran to my car and made the 30-minute drive in less than 20, jeopardizing my safety and that of every other driver on the freeway. I need a tissue. Does somebody have a tissue?
I'll get you some.
Thank you. Thank you, sweetie. Sorry. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Lizzie was surrounded by her mother, stepfather, and several of her stepfather's children. She was pale, beyond pale. IVs were in place and pumping her with antibiotics, saline, anything to get her blood pressure to rise. We stood around her, curtain closed against the broken limbs and lacerations passing by. We stroked her and talked to her for hours, urging her to respond, reminding her of the 70 years of life that lay ahead. Thank you. The monitor sounded and a young man in nurse's scrubs suddenly appeared. He climbed onto the bed, straddled Lizzie, and worked with a passion I'd never seen and have not seen since to resurrect her heartbeat. After nearly a quarter hour, Lee touched his shoulder. She's gone. You can stop. He continued, back bent into the frantic pressing and releasing of hands against chest, and then his shoulders sagged and he climbed off the bed. We were too stunned to speak. Lizzie was 15. Children are not supposed to die. A bacteria had invaded this beautiful child. The flu-like symptoms she had suffered on Christmas Day killed her one day later. This death, following too closely the suicide of a friend's teenage son, left me angry and confused. I struggled to make sense of it, to go deep into my heart, my soul, to find some explanation, anything, but there was nothing there. No faith, no hope, nothing. That place where hope once resided, where faith once teased and occasionally emerged, had turned into a dark space. I was empty, a conch with an echo where life had once lived. I couldn't make sense of these tragedies. How could I explain them to my children? I spoke at the funeral and recited a poem I'd written for the occasion. It didn't rhyme. As I stood before this child's family and friends, my lips moving, the words spilling out, I was aware of feeling nothing. My heart was closed. Many years later, I read a poem by Frederick William Henry Myers and thought how painful it can be to desperately want to believe, to have faith in God, to have faith in any power, and to live with the fear that life could come and go without understanding what we believe. It's called A Last Appeal. Oh, somewhere, God unknown, exist and be. I'm dying, I'm all alone, I must have thee. God, my sense, my soul, my all, dies in the cry. Saw'st thou the faint star flame and fall? Ah, it was I. The writers in this book have accepted the challenge of exploring their thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, and for many they've searched with more intensity and honesty than ever before. Some have seen the faint star flame and fall, others have not, and a few are still hoping. So I'd like to introduce now, and I'm not going to give you bios on the authors, they're in the back of the book, so you can read it there. We don't want to take the time. Barbara Graham. Barbara's a wonderful writer, and I look forward to letting you hear what I know she's written.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you to Book Passage. I've been privileged enough to read here many times, and it's always a joy, and I treasure this store as Victoria does. And thank you, Victoria, for inviting me to contribute to this book. And I don't know whether I'm a believer, an agnostic, or an atheist. I will let you decide. I'm going to pour myself a little water here. My essay is called Grace Happens. I have come to Germany to be saved. Not from Satan in that Jesus rapture float up to heaven sort of way. I have come to be saved from myself. It might seem odd for a Jewish pilgrim from New York to be searching for salvation in Hadamar, the tiny village where Joseph Mengele conducted his evil experiments. But this is the town where many devotees who travel to see Mother Meera stay. Born in India to farmers, Mother Meera was recognized as an incarnation of the divine feminine when she was 8 years old. In her book, Answers, she explains that her purpose is to help humans and to make them happy, peaceful, contented, harmonious, and loving. I want to be all of those things. More than anything, I want to stop being afraid of everything. Still, I'm not sure whether a person who is, confusingly, both a skeptic and a true believer, i.e. me, can be helped, but I'm hoping for a little grace. I'm nervous and excited as our group from the hotel boards the shuttle bus that will take us to Talheim, the nearby hamlet where Mother lives. Roughly, and where she lives and where she offers darshan. Roughly translated from the Hindi, darshan means a meeting with a holy person. It is a moonless, frigid evening in February, and I am with my two best friends, Mark and Florence. As our bus bumps along the country road, I notice the actor Terence Stamp sitting up front right behind the driver. I wonder if he, like me, has come to Germany hoping to experience bliss, or at the very least, relief from an endlessly spinning, and in my case, chronically terrified, monkey mind. Many of my friends, including Mark and Florence, are seasoned veterans of darshan with Mother Meera. From them, I've heard reports of extraordinary states elicited by her presence. Profound peace, exquisite joy, myriad visions, perfect love, showers of white light like a heavenly snowfall. I'm trying to tamp down my expectations. I've been around spiritual circles long enough to know that mystical fireworks are not the point. Still, I yearn. I can't help it. I have serious issues with my own mother, which may help to explain why I long to be bathed in the unconditional love of the Divine Mother. I'm hoping a little taste of the divine will give me the confidence boost I need to believe that I'm not broken. Stop worrying so much, Mark tells me. Your experience will be whatever it is. You can't control it, so you might as well just let go. Ha, I say. If I knew how to let go, I probably wouldn't be here. Darshan, which lasts about 2 hours, is held entirely in silence. Once we're settled in the room and Mother Meera appears, I am awed by my first glimpse of this woman. In her purple and gold sari, she looks like a queen. The ritual is precisely structured. We approach her one by one. When it's our turn, we do pranam. That is, we kneel before Mother Meera, allowing her to hold our head in her hands. This lasts for about 30 seconds. When she releases our head, we gaze into her eyes for however long she gazes into ours. Quote, I am looking at everything within you to see where I can help, where I can give healing and power, she says in her book. This part goes on for another 20 or 30 seconds, and sometimes less, as I will soon discover. I wish I could report that I felt a powerful current when Mother Meera held my head, or a blast of divine light when she looked into my eyes, but I did not. The experience was lovely in a simple, quiet sort of way, but I'd been hoping for more of a big bang effect, and I was disappointed. The night after my second darshan, ho-hum also, I am awakened by a horrific nightmare. As with most of my nightmares and daymares, it's about my son. In this one, I'm standing on a beach during a violent storm, watching helplessly as my boy is carried out to sea. Half awake, I lie in the darkness, trembling, drenched in sweat. My first thought is, why does everyone else who comes here have blissful, transcendent experiences while I'm stuck in the shadow zone of my stubborn, fearful mind? My second thought is, the fact that this nightmare occurred here is auspicious. Now, finally, I have the opportunity to relinquish my terror by turning it over to the Divine Mother, who in my imaginings will absorb it like a sponge, then neutralize it with love. What's more, my expectations are cosmic. Not only will she free me from the legacy of fear that continues to hold me in its grip and which I've passed on to my son like a bad gene, she'll free him and future generations too. That evening in darshan, I'm shaking as Mother Meera holds my head during pranam and I start to sob when she looks into my eyes. Then something shocking happens that I haven't witnessed with anyone else. Instead of fixing me in her usual 30-second gaze, she dismisses me almost immediately. I feel devastated, rejected, rebuffed, unseen, crushed. Not only were my emotions too much for my own mother to deal with, the divine mother can't seem to handle them either. Florence stays up half the night trying to console me. You can't take it personally, she says. Mother Mira does what she deems best for each person. Try to trust that she gives you what in her greater wisdom she senses you need most. But I don't believe her. I don't believe I need rejection. The remaining darshans are fine, and I get as much time with Mother as anyone, but that single darshan stains my perception. I leave Talheim feeling alone, defective, without the blessing I long for. My experience in Germany is sort of a spiritual riddle that takes me years to solve, years to grasp, in fact, that I did get what I needed most. Shortly before his death, the Buddha told his grieving, broken-hearted disciples who had been with him for 40 years, "Be a lamp unto yourself, be a refuge to yourself. Look not for a refuge in anyone beside yourself." I see now that by looking away so quickly, Mother Mira was returning to me the whole catastrophe that I had hoped to turn over to her. Not because she couldn't handle my distress, but because she wanted me to know that I could handle it. She saw what I needed most was to take refuge in myself, to trust my own capacity to heal and wake up. The light she shone that night led me home to myself. That was her blessing that for so long felt like a curse. Fear may have been hardwired into my DNA, but it also provided me with a slant on life, an identity, a false sense of protection and control, a kind of armor that held me together while also holding me captive. Who am I without it? Though it may take a lifetime to answer this question, the moment I pose it, I feel joyful, exhilarated, the way I imagine skydivers must feel free-falling through space. There is just life as it is this moment, the wonder, the beauty, the pain, the mystery, faith even that the ground will rise up to meet me. For so many years lacking confidence in myself, I searched for someone who could save me and make me feel whole. Lovers, sages, gurus, psychics, therapists, healers. Finally, I got what I was after, but in the most surprising way. In a sort of cosmic joke, I went to Germany to be saved by the Divine Mother, only to discover that there's nothing to be saved from. Not even fear, which I see now, comes and goes, as insubstantial as a bank of clouds scudding across the afternoon sky.
I'm so lucky. I get to deal with the most amazing people. And what I love about anthologies is that every anthology becomes a community. So it becomes a family of friends. They meet each other. They create friendships. They go off on family vacations together. It's wonderful. It really is. It's sort of like being a matchmaker. All right, our next speaker is Aviva Layton. Aviva and I go back a long way. We're dear friends. My guest room has her name on it. Her guest room has my name on it. And when you look at the book, you'll see that after Aviva's essay, there's a page that is in memory of her husband. And Leon Whiteson was a brilliant writer, a fierce, wonderful man who passed away before he had a chance to write his essay, but I made sure, and I have a wonderful publisher that made sure that he was honored. So Aviva.
My essay is entitled Poof. My husband, Leon Whiteson, died on August the 25th, 2013. The process of dying was neither serene nor peaceful. We had lived with a diagnosis of aggressive bladder cancer for over 2 years, and he'd been through the medical mill. Cystectomy, radiation, chemotherapy, the full catastrophe, to quote Zorba. Finally, refusing to go the experimental drug route, he chose at-home hospice. After a brief honeymoon period during which we both fantasized we'd be able to buy at least 6 good months, it quickly became apparent that Leon was down to his final days. His study, which had been filled with the paraphernalia of writing, a desk overflowing with post-its, notebooks, lists, erasers, paper clips, scotch tape, was now filled with the paraphernalia of death. A hospital bed, adult wipes, thermometers, medical gloves, an oxygen tank, pads, and enough meds to fill a pharmacy. He lay there for 3 days, drugged with morphine to block his intense pain, his body wasted, his face haggard, his only desire to die as soon as possible. Friends and family gathered around to say their farewells, and although Leon was unresponsive, I was greatly comforted by their presence. There was one visit, however, I dreaded, that of our grandson, his wife, and their children, Hazel, 4, and Silas, 6. The children both adored their grandpa. Great-grandpa was too much to get their heads around, who used to play endless games with them, spray them with the garden hose, and help them gather oranges from our tree. Although their parents were adamant about bringing the children, I didn't want them to participate in what was essentially a death watch. The thought that the last memory of their beloved grandpa would be of him tethered to an oxygen tank, unable to respond, doped out on morphine, his mouth fixed in a grotesque rictus, was something I was absolutely set against, but their parents would not be dissuaded. As it turned out, they were right and I was wrong. Far from being traumatized, both children understood that Leon was dying and stood quietly by his bedside. Later, Hazel asked her father to take her into Leon's room a second time. Staring at his closed eyes and unresponsive body, she said solemnly, "Grandpa was here, and now he's gone." Poof. And that was as perfect an explanation as I've ever heard of the enormity of what had happened in my life. There's nothing more life-changing than death. Knowing that his death was imminent, Leon never once expressed the slightest interest in seeing a rabbi or a spiritual advisor, even though hospice kept suggesting one. After he died, I examined my thoughts for any trace of a belief in an afterlife, a presiding deity, or even some sort of transmutation of energy, but I came up blank. For me, belief in a deity simply was not an option. If, as Jung posited, our concept of God is a collective fantasy, and every human contains a multitude of archetypes, one of which is a god, then I must have been born one archetype short. The only prayer I ever offered up was when I was 8, I'm now in my 80s, and had lost my gollywog. Gollywogs have thankfully lost their popularity because they're possibly the most politically incorrect toys ever to be created. In the early 30s, however, the term politically incorrect hadn't been invented, and so gollywogs were as ubiquitous as dolls or toy trucks. Modelled after a character in a 19th century children's books, these toys had coal black faces, wild frizzy hair, protruding eyes rimmed in white, grinning red mouths, bow ties, red jackets, and striped trousers. They were grotesque, but I adored my gollywog, and I was so devastated I decided to send up a prayer to a god I'd always suspected never existed. I folded my hands as I'd observed my Christian friends doing in school and prayed silently. I can recall the exact words as if they were yesterday. "Please, God, I don't really believe in you, but if by chance you're really there, please help me find my gollywog." God failed me miserably. I never did find my beloved gollywog, which to a deist may in itself be proof of a God who disapproved of racism. Although that incident wrapped up my religious ditherings, the invisible gollywog and the invisible God somehow became entangled in my imagination. And from then on, whenever someone mentioned God, I pictured him as a giant black figure dressed in striped trousers and a wide bow tie, grinning down menacingly on his subjects with a huge red slash of a mouth. A golly god. I was taken by surprise when I researched the word gollywog and found that apart from probably being the derivation of the term wog, it actually has a linguistic connection to God, golly being an expression used to avoid taking the name of God in vain. If I were brought up in any faith at all, it was the communist faith. I spent the first decade of my life calling Lenin Uncle Ilya. Because my family and most of their friends were Russian Jews, I assumed that all Russians were Jews who spoke Yiddish. Every Sunday my father would take me to the Domain, Sydney's equivalent of Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park, hand me a stack of Tribunes, a local communist paper, and send me out into the crowds where I would solicit sales by calling out in my shrillest voice, "Support the workers, buy a Trib." But there was another powerful force trying to pull me in the other direction. That of my maternal grandfather, who was an Orthodox Jew. In deference to my grandfather's wishes, my parents would allow me to accompany him to synagogue every Yom Kippur and watch as the prayer shawl men swayed with religious fervour, beating their breasts while muttering in some strange language as they bobbed up and down in front of the bima. Somehow the idea that an entity, any entity, would bother to take an interest in the antics of old men with stale breath seemed neither probable nor possible. And anyway, I reasoned, even if there were a God, why would he demand to be worshipped and obeyed? To me, it was tantamount to my parents expecting me to worship and obey them simply because they had created me. Surely the act of creation didn't demand eternal obedience, let alone eternal love. As a recalcitrant and rebellious child, that notion didn't appeal to me in the slightest. Shortly after Leon died, I Googled the streetscape of our house in Los Angeles, hoping in a moment of magical thinking that I might see him pottering around in our front garden. The way I was able to guide that small Google hand straight to the minuscule spot on the planet I inhabited reminded me of the way people had spoken of God when I was a child, a sort of Google prototype who could see what was going on in every corner of the world, however remote. He was a supreme Googler who could hone in on a Lithuanian shtetl on the Sabbath to make sure that my mother hadn't committed the unspeakable and unforgivable sin of carrying her handkerchief. It was considered work, which was forbidden on the day of rest, instead of pinning it to the bodice of her dress. He could also zoom in on the lonely earth mass of Australia sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, target Sydney, then swoop down on that tiny shul in Bondi Junction to make sure that my grandfather was shuffling back and forth in obedience to his commands. But why this all-powerful God should care about whether my mother was a good girl or whether my grandfather prayed fervently enough was utterly beyond me. And as I googled the garden, was God now googling me, recognizing my pain and loneliness? The answer, of course, was no. I'm just going to read another little bit from a few pages in. This is not to say I haven't been envious of people who wholeheartedly believe in divine intervention, in the existence of an all-loving God, in forgiveness, salvation, and eternal life. Religion, says Philip Larkin in his poem Aubade, is a vast moth-eaten brocade created to pretend we never die. But life's hard enough, and we need all the comfort we can get, no matter from what entity, be it Jehovah or Allah or Shiva or Gaia or some diffuse higher power. Whatever or whoever gets you through the night, even if it means praying to the great gollywog in the sky. And though I've always eschewed the rituals of religion, I felt the need to dispose of Leon's ashes in some ritualistic way. They're now buried under one of his favourite flowering plants in our back garden. When Hazel's brother Silas asked what I had done with Grandpa's ashes, I showed him the mound that marked the place. He stared intently at it for a minute and then asked if his grandpa would grow again. I wish he would, I replied, but sadly he won't. Secretly, though, I imagine waking up one morning and finding a baby Leon under the leaves. Or maybe he'd be fully formed with his trademark moustache. Meanwhile, unlike deists, I have proof positive that there is no afterlife. My husband was a passionate, bordering on the obsessive gardener. I remember when he was well, he once remarked that when he died, his garden would die with him. I understood that. What I didn't understand was that when he began to decline, the garden would decline with him. As his cancer metastasized, so did the spiderwebs, the rampant vines that were slowly strangling some of the small trees, the giant raccoons who left huge mounds of scat all over the back deck, which itself was suffering from dry rot and termite infestation. In the last stages of his life, when he was prescribed steroids, which gave him a deceptively rosy glow, friends would remark how healthy he looked. He'd tell me afterwards that he felt like a termite-infested house that looked wonderful from the outside but would collapse if someone slammed the front door. Prescient words both for himself and his beloved garden. It was obvious that Leon's garden was fast spiralling out of control, but he wouldn't hear of anyone interfering, even though he could no longer do any gardening himself. The result was that after he died, I needed to hire a crew to chop down the dead trees, the strangling vines, the mounds of mouldy leaves and mulch. During the first few hours of his cleansing, I had a feeling that Leon might come roaring back to defend his territory, but he didn't. Absolute proof that there's no afterlife, because if there were, he would have reappeared, if only as some cosmic force. Just as I wish he had roared with fury at the desecration of his garden, I wish he would come back as a ghost. Even though I've never believed in ghosts, I've always been terrified of him. Not anymore. I'd love Leon's ghost to appear at the foot of my bed, preferably in it.
It's my pleasure now to introduce my friend David Corbett. David's a remarkable man. I was working on a screenplay and I thought, there's something missing. I don't know what it is. I thought, I know what it is. It's a story about a bunch of men, and I don't have enough testosterone to tell the story. So I called David and said, David, I've got this screenplay. Would you look at it and tell me what you think? Can you add to it? And boy, did he ever. So, David, it's all yours.
One of the real joys of this experience is this is the first time I've heard or even had a chance to read, because I've never had the book in my hands until now, the other essays. And it's been really eye-opening. In fact, I'm sitting there just going, I shouldn't read that section, I should read this section. Oh, she just said that, well, I should read this. And actually, I sort of listened to Aviva. I thought that if God's will is inscrutable, then anything is justified. And that's a horrific thing to think about. And it reminded me that one of the things I actually did come away with from Catholicism, and one of the things I appreciated, was the whole Aquinas example, that reason and faith are not only not incompatible, they're inseparable. Of course, then I learned that he stole that idea from a Jewish philosopher named Moses Maimonides, who stole the idea from an Islamic philosopher named Averroes. And which leads me to actually my two favorite jokes about religion, both from James Joyce, which is when he was, of course, excoriated in the Catholic Church, someone said, well, if you hate Catholicism so much, why don't you convert to Protestantism? And his off-the-cuff answer was, I've lost my faith, man, not my mind. And the answer he gave in Portrait of the Artist was, why would I give up a coherent absurdity for an incoherent? And with that, I thought, I'll begin my little essay here. I've never written anything like this before. It's probably one of the more personal things I've ever done, so excuse me if I wander a little bit into the weeds. Anyway, the title is Love and Insomnia. I did not lose my faith so much as shrug it off, like a coat I'd come to realize wasn't up to the weather. I needed something sturdier, more reliable, something crafted more honestly and simply. I had my suspicions about God as early as adolescence, only to see them confirmed for good during the darkest hours of my life. Fortunately, I discovered other resources to rely upon. Some background. I was a blue baby and only survived birth through the determined intervention of the medical team at Mount Carmel Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. This was back in the days when a mismatch of RH factors between mother and newborn often proved fatal. My mother had almost died in childbirth with Jim, the second of the 4 boys, and her doctors had warned her against having any more children. But she was Catholic, and so both contraception and abortion were off the table. Beautiful, curly-haired John ensued, with no complications. Creating a bit of false optimism, perhaps. Then came me, RH positive to my mother's RH negative. The beginning of a compatibility standoff that would never truly abate. While I hovered near death, the doctors ordered a full body transfusion and complete quarantine, and my mother wasn't permitted to nurse or even hold me. I remained behind in the hospital for 6 weeks, a crucial period for mother-child bonding, another telltale sign of life to come. I remember none of this, of course, nor do I remember the pediatric nurse who, according to family lore, developed such a devotion to me. That she ventured into a blizzard on a municipal bus to deliver a Christmas present 6 months later. A scratchy wool bear I would unimaginatively name Teddy. My first recollection is of clutching that bear, by then already one-eyed, with tufts of coarse fur missing. As I rose from my bed at night, unable to sleep. I might even say my self-awareness, my consciousness, was born in insomnia, which afflicted me nightly. Emerging from the bedroom I shared with my brother John, I would first look right toward my mother's room. The door, as always, would be locked, with a washcloth wedged in the door jamb to perfect its silence. And so I turned left, toward the next room down, where my father slept. For some reason, I'm really emotional. Each night, despite the long day behind him and the next one ahead, he roused himself from sleep, slipped on his glasses, lifted me up, and with his pillow mussed hair, took me into the living room and sat with me in the family rocker, where I perched in his lap and curled into his chest, clutching my poor monocular bear, and gratefully rocked to sleep. Looking back, this dynamic, established so early, became the framework of my life, my mind, and my character. On the one hand, a deep sense of unease abided within me, mitigated only by the stoic, patient, largely silent, but reliably loving concern of my father. On the other hand, my mother's extravagant moods. She suffered from borderline personality disorder and self-medicated with alcohol, would continue to nurture my anxiety and emotional uncertainty. Her affections were devout, but dramatic, unpredictable, freighted with need. In a family of scared men, she reigned all but absolutely. The role of lone apostate deferred to me. Though I secretly longed to be closer to her, I never trusted her, often feared her, and I'm ashamed to admit, at times even despised her. The saccharine, manipulative endearment she used to beguile my father and brothers seemed a kind of black enchantment, and I pledged myself to leaving home as soon as circumstances allowed. Ironically, I wasted much of my early romantic efforts unwittingly searching for her duplicate. I could not recognize love except in seduction and turmoil. Through her, I suppose, I learned the humbling power of the unconscious and its eerily invisible control over my behavior. Fortunately, I would also learn, later and elsewhere, the power of insight and acceptance and the genuine possibility of change. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My changing relationship with my brother John reinforced the curious dynamic with my mother. In the beginning, John and I were quite close. He was 3 years older, but he looked after me, played with me, introduced me to the other kids in the neighborhood, and served as my protector. Then, about the time he entered Catholic school, he changed. He recognized he was different, and long before he knew the words homosexual or gay, he felt a special type of scrutiny. With no way to express the increasing sense of dread and shame and guilt he felt, he projected those feelings onto me. Just as my mother routinely shamed, degraded, and criticized my father, so John began a reign of terror with me, finding fault with absolutely everything I did. The other family members often joked about how capably I handled this onslaught of criticism, not realizing how much it was misshapen me inside. But the message I learned was this: only perfection guarantees love. And I knew I was hideously, sloppily, perfectly imperfect. This message was echoed at Catholic school. We were made in the image of God, we were told, and since God was perfect, anything less than perfection was unacceptable. Even children, especially children in some minds, were rank with sin. And though God in his mercy, the argument could forgive us and, after death, embrace us, this always felt like a long shot. We were taught to hate ourselves and the weakness of our nature. We were the banished children of Eve, mourning and weeping in our vale of tears. Not surprisingly, my role as family heretic followed me to school. I never quite fell for the company line in either domain, though I relished the Bible stories and proved adept in the rigors of catechism. While several of the priests and nuns I met were truly decent, even admirable, far too many were sanctimonious bullies, the best of whom admittedly possessed a kind of mercurial, benevolent but cruel strength, something I'd later recognize as the hallmark of fascism. Far more often than not, though, it seemed the more devout the patter, the more spiteful and meager the spirit. If a life devoted to God created such misshapen, punitive, unhappy souls, I thought, who but a fool would bother? To top all that off, the vast majority of the truly exceptional priests and nuns I met ended up surrendering their vows or left the church altogether. But the beauty and majesty of faith, the intellectual rigor of Augustine and Ambrose and Aquinas, the courage of the martyrs and missionaries, the spirit that inspired Gregorian chant and liturgical polyphony, and the masses of Bach and Mozart, not to mention the Sistine Chapel and the great cathedrals of Europe, this I couldn't shake off so handily. Who was I to question the ineffable something that drove so many to such excellence? I'll stop there. That kind of should the first argument. First, I come up and do Q&A for any of you, and but we're all around if you want to ask, I guess, individual ones of us questions. I'm sure we can answer. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Before we do a Q&A, I'm going to take about 2 minutes to read from Ann Perry's essay. I spoke to her this morning and said that I wanted to do this, and she said that would be lovely because she can't be here to do it herself. So this is just a short little piece here. Her essay is called What Do I Believe? What do I believe? It has been a long journey of discovery. There have been hesitations and errors along the way, and no doubt will be more, because I am still learning, both about myself and about life. I have two voices within me. In my head there is that of my father. He was an astronomer and theoretical physicist. I remember him teaching me when I was about 3 that the sun was a star like any other, and about 9 minutes away at the speed of light. At the same time, he also taught me that Nazis and Germans were not necessarily the same thing. That was the more important of the two, especially since we were in London, and it was the darkest days of World War II. The message was clear: don't label and don't judge. He believed in the immeasurable beauty of creation and the love of knowledge, but not in a God. He looked at what man has done and continues to do in the name of religion, and he found it aberrant. To him, kindness was the great virtue. The other voice in my head is that of my maternal grandfather, whom I knew only through the memories of my grandmother. He was a chaplain in the trenches during World War I and the hero of my mystery series set in that time. It was my grandmother who told me the stories of the New Testament in her own search for the same strength he had possessed. My favorite story was of Jesus taking time from his teaching to go and visit the sick daughter of Jairus, even though he had been told it was too late, the girl was already dead. He answered that she was only sleeping and said to her, "Maiden, arise," and she awoke. Jesus cared even about sick little girls. I was just such a sick little girl. On one occasion, the doctor told my mother he would come back in the morning and sign the certificate of death, but she would never give up. He returned to find my fever broken and me arisen. That story sank deeply into me because I need to believe that God cares for even the least significant of us. So what do I believe? It must make intellectual sense, even if my understanding is still incomplete. But more than that, it must make moral sense. How can I worship a God who is unfair? I cannot accept that anyone can be guilty without knowledge of both good and bad, or more likely, better and worse, and they must have the ability to choose. Blame without responsibility is inherently unjust. Would God have created us, then told us not to seek knowledge of the difference between good and evil, and expected us to obey forever? Could anyone be so blind to human nature? And that doesn't even address the question of why he would wish us to remain innocent, when it is essentially the same as ignorant, without growth or experience. That is the same as not being born at all. It makes the whole existence purposeless. I can't accept that. I'm going to move forward very quickly. I've considered the possibility that in a way all beauty of sense or hunger in the heart is not so much different in where we are, but in our ability to perceive it. I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said that heaven is like a symphony concert hall. You can let anyone in, but you cannot make them hear the music. Learning to hear the music, all of it, every note, may be the exquisite refining of the spirit that takes much time and experience with much courage. We need the passion of hope, the hunger for beauty that even a glimpse of it will bring. Heart and intellect should walk together. Do I believe in the Christ of the New Testament because I want to so much? Am I afraid of a universe in which there is nothing beyond what I can see and someone can prove? Yes, I am afraid of it, but has that anything to do with truth or only my perception of it? That cool voice of logic again. Maybe I also believe it because I need to. The alternative is despair. I have certainly considered that possibility, especially at 3 a.m. when I feel small and miserable and desperately alone. Haven't we all? I'm going to go to the very end here. The greatest commandments of Christianity are love God and love thy neighbor as thyself. Perhaps the latter could also be said as watch with me. There are griefs everyone faces at one time or another, when a hand holding ours in the darkness is all that gets us through, and the promise, I will not leave you. We have our 3 o'clock in the morning moments when it is as if we are alone in the universe. The tides are drowning us. That is when we know who or what is what we really believe. I have surprised myself with how instinctively I turn to God. The more I study the history of mankind and the philosophies we have hammered out of our confusion and seeking, the more insistently do I hear the voice of my grandfather, and the faith that survives keeps you sane without panic or despair, even in the darkest night. If you cannot see the star any longer, remember that you once did, and keep going. Follow where you know it was, remember it was beautiful, and never lose what's inside of you. And what is in that little silver needle case that hangs on my bedroom door, written on a slip of paper and in my heart? Be still and know that I am God. Thank you, Annie. Questions for any of the authors? Comments you want to make? Dialogue between yourselves? Sir.
Yes, putting together a collection like this underscores the diversity of faiths. And when we talk about faith and we